I still remember every single detail of that October evening when my entire world came crashing down around me like a house of cards in a hurricane. The rain was pounding mercilessly against the windows of St. Mary's Children's Hospital as I walked down the sterile hallway for what I didn't know would be the last time, my cleaning cart squeaking with each step like a mouse crying for help. My name is Diamond Williams, and for the past 2 years and 4 months, I'd been working as a custodial technician at one of Atlanta's most prestigious pediatric medical facilities. I loved my job with every fiber of my being, even though it didn't pay nearly enough to cover all my expenses. There was something deeply satisfying and meaningful about keeping those hospital rooms spotless for the brave little fighters battling cancer, the premature babies in the NICU struggling for every breath, and all the other children who needed a clean, safe environment to heal and recover. Every surface I wiped down with careful attention, every floor I mopped until it gleamed, every trash can I emptied, it all felt like I was contributing to their recovery in some small but important way. But that particular day was different from all the others. That day, everything I thought I knew about fairness, justice, and basic human decency would be shattered into a million pieces. The morning had started normally enough. I'd gotten up at 5:30 a.m., just like I did every weekday, and quietly prepared breakfast for my 8-year-old son Marcus. Marcus had been diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia 6 months earlier, and the treatment had left him weak and fragile, but he was still the light of my life, the reason I got up every morning and fought through every challenge. His father, Jerome, had walked out on us when Marcus was just 2 years old, claiming he wasn't ready for the responsibility of raising a child. Looking back, I realize it was a blessing in disguise because Jerome had always been selfish and unreliable. But at the time, it felt like another devastating blow in a life that already seemed filled with more struggles than victories. Since then, it had been just Marcus and me against the world, and I would have walked through fire, climbed the highest mountain, or fought 1,000 dragons to protect that precious little boy. When the doctors at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta delivered the devastating news about his leukemia diagnosis, telling me in that gentle but clinical way that doctors have perfected, my world stopped spinning on its axis. The treatment protocol was aggressive and comprehensive, involving multiple rounds of chemotherapy, regular hospital stays, countless blood tests, and a regimen of medications that had names I couldn't pronounce. Even with insurance through my job at the hospital, the co-pays, deductibles, and out-of-network specialists were bleeding me dry financially. The bills kept coming like an avalanche, each one more intimidating than the last. I'd taken on every available extra shift, sold everything valuable I owned, my grandmother's jewelry, my small television, even my car, and bought a cheaper one, and was still falling behind on the mounting medical expenses. The financial counselor at the Children's Hospital had given me a stack of forms to apply for assistance programs, but the paperwork was overwhelming and the waiting lists were months long. Every night, I would sit at my small kitchen table after Marcus went to sleep, surrounded by medical bills, insurance statements, and payment plan agreements, trying to figure out how to make the numbers work. I had notebooks filled with calculations, different scenarios for stretching our money, lists of which bills could be delayed and which ones were absolutely critical. That October morning, I'd arrived at St. Mary's at 6:45 a.m., 15 minutes early as always. I took pride in my punctuality and reliability, and in 2 years of employment, I had never been late, never called in sick unless Marcus was having a particularly bad day with his treatment, and never received a single complaint about my work quality. I was just finishing up my assigned section on the 3rd floor oncology ward, carefully disinfecting the nurse's station and making sure all the medical equipment was properly cleaned, when my supervisor, Mrs. Patricia Jenkins, came storming down the hallway with an expression on her face that immediately made my stomach drop. Patricia was a woman in her late 50s with prematurely graying hair that she kept pulled back in a tight, severe bun and the kind of stern, unforgiving expression that made everyone nervous. She'd been at the hospital for over 20 years and ran the housekeeping department with an iron fist, demanding perfection from her staff and showing little tolerance for any mistakes or excuses. In the 2 years I'd worked under her supervision, our relationship had been cordial but distant. She was fair in her assignments and scheduling, and she'd even been understanding when I needed to take time off for Marcus's medical appointments. But I'd always sensed that she saw me as just another employee, someone to manage rather than someone to connect with on a personal level. "Diamond," she called out sharply, her voice echoing off the sterile hospital walls in a way that made several nurses look up from their work. "I need to see you in my office immediately." Drop what you're doing and come with me right now." My heart began beating faster, and I felt that familiar flutter of anxiety in my chest that I'd learned to recognize over the years. Something about her tone, the rigidity of her posture, and the way she avoided making direct eye contact told me this wasn't going to be a routine check-in or a discussion about scheduling changes. I carefully parked my cleaning cart by the nurse's station, made sure all my supplies were properly secured, and followed her down to the basement level where the administrative offices were located. The walk felt endless, and with each step my anxiety grew stronger. Her office was cramped and cluttered with schedules tacked to bulletin boards, supply catalogs stacked on every available surface, and employee files stuffed into overflowing cabinets. The fluorescent light above her desk flickered intermittently, casting harsh, unflattering shadows across her face as she settled behind her metal desk with a heavy sigh. The office smelled of stale coffee and industrial cleaning supplies, with an underlying mustiness that suggested poor ventilation. It wasn't a comfortable or welcoming space, which seemed to reflect Patricia's management style perfectly. "Sit down, Diamond," she said curtly, not looking up from a manila folder that lay open in front of her. Her voice carried an edge I'd never heard before, and it made me even more nervous. I sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair across from her desk, the kind of cheap institutional furniture that was designed for function rather than comfort. I folded my hands in my lap to stop them from trembling and tried to ignore the anxious flutter in my stomach that was growing stronger by the second. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity but was probably only 30 seconds. Patricia seemed to be reading something in the file, occasionally making small humming sounds or clicking her tongue in a way that suggested disapproval. "We have a very serious problem, Diamond," she finally began, looking up at me with cold, accusatory eyes that seemed to be looking right through me rather than at me. "Money has been going missing from the employee break room. Small amounts at first, $10 or $20 here and there, but it's been escalating over the past few weeks." My mouth immediately went dry and I felt my palms begin to sweat. The way she was looking at me, the tone of her voice, and the formal setup of this meeting all suggested that somehow, in some way I couldn't understand, this problem was connected to me. "I don't understand," I managed to say, my voice coming out smaller and weaker than I intended. "What does that have to do with me? I've never taken anything from anyone. Several employees have reported seeing you near the break room during times when thefts occurred," she continued, ignoring my protestation and referring to notes in her file. "Yesterday afternoon, Nurse Rebecca Martinez discovered that $40 was missing from her purse, which she had left in her locker. Today, Dr. Thompson found that his wallet was lighter by $60 when he went to buy lunch." The words hit me like a series of physical blows, each accusation landing harder than the last. I felt the blood drain from my face, and for a moment I worried I might actually faint right there in her office. "Mrs. Jenkins, I would never," I started to say, but she cut me off with a sharp gesture. "The security footage shows you cleaning the break room around the same times these incidents occurred," she continued relentlessly. "And frankly, Diamond, you've been acting strange lately. Distracted during work, always on your phone making calls about medical bills and treatments, asking other employees about payment plans and financial assistance programs." That last part was true, but not for the reasons she was implying. My life had become a constant juggling act of work responsibilities, Marcus's medical appointments, and navigating the complex world of insurance claims and medical billing. I'd been making those phone calls during my breaks, trying to set up payment plans for Marcus's treatments and researching financial assistance programs that might help us. The stress had been overwhelming, and I'm sure it showed in my work performance. There had been days when I'd been so tired from staying up all night with Marcus during his chemotherapy reactions that I'd moved more slowly than usual. There had been times when I'd been distracted by worry about his condition or anxiety about our financial situation. But I had never, not once, considered taking money that didn't belong to me. The very idea was repugnant to everything I believed in and everything I'd taught Marcus about right and wrong. Marcus was everything to me. My whole world, my reason for living, my motivation to keep fighting through every challenge life threw at us. His father, Jerome, had left when Marcus was just 2 years old, claiming he wasn't ready for the responsibility of raising a child. At the time, I'd been devastated by his abandonment, but looking back, I realized it had actually been a blessing in disguise. Jerome had always been selfish and unreliable, more interested in hanging out with his friends and pursuing his own interests than in building a family or taking care of his responsibilities. When he left, he took nothing but his clothes and his PlayStation, and he never looked back or asked about Marcus's well-being. Since then, it had been just Marcus and me, and we'd built a strong, loving relationship based on trust, honesty, and mutual support. When the doctors at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta delivered the devastating news about his leukemia diagnosis 6 months earlier, explaining the treatment protocol and the potential side effects with that combination of professionalism and compassion that pediatric oncologists develop, my world had stopped spinning. The treatment was aggressive and comprehensive, involving multiple phases of chemotherapy that would last for over 2 years. The first phase, called induction therapy, was designed to kill as many cancer cells as possible and achieve remission. The second phase, consolidation therapy, would eliminate any remaining cancer cells that might not be detected by standard tests. The final phase, maintenance therapy, would continue for months to prevent the cancer from returning. Even with insurance through my job at the hospital, the financial burden was staggering. The co-pays for each chemotherapy session were $150. The specialized medications Marcus needed cost hundreds of dollars per month even after insurance. The regular blood tests, scans, and doctor visits added up quickly. When Marcus needed to be hospitalized for complications or intensive treatment, the bills could easily reach thousands of dollars. I'd taken on every available extra shift, working double shifts whenever possible and picking up weekend work when it was offered. I'd sold my grandmother's engagement ring, the one piece of jewelry I'd planned to pass down to Marcus's future wife someday. I'd downgraded our cable package, switched to the cheapest cell phone plan available, and started buying generic groceries exclusively. But it still wasn't enough. The bills kept coming, each one more intimidating than the last, and I was falling further behind despite my best efforts. "Mrs. Jenkins, I swear to you on my son's life," I said, my voice shaking with emotion and desperation, "I have never stolen a single penny from anyone in this hospital or anywhere else. Yes, I've been stressed about Marcus's medical bills, but I would never steal money from my co-workers. These people are trying to help sick children like my son. The idea of stealing from them is unthinkable to me." She leaned back in her chair, her expression unchanged and unmoved by my emotional plea. "Diamond, I've been doing this job for 23 years. I've supervised hundreds of employees during that time, and I've seen every excuse, every justification, and every sob story you can imagine." She paused, letting that sink in before continuing. "I've seen employees steal everything from office supplies to medical equipment to cash from their coworkers' purses. And it's almost always the ones going through financial hardship who find ways to justify it to themselves. They tell themselves it's just borrowing, or that they deserve it because they work so hard, or that the person they're stealing from won't miss it. But I didn't steal anything," I said again, more forcefully this time. "I understand that my financial situation makes me look suspicious, but being desperate doesn't make me guilty. You need to check your facts more carefully." "The decision has already been made," she interrupted, her voice becoming even colder and more formal. "I've spoken with Human Resources and the hospital administration. Your employment is being terminated immediately, effective as of right now. Security will escort you out of the building, and you are permanently banned from all hospital property." The room started spinning around me, and I gripped the arms of the plastic chair to keep myself steady. This couldn't be happening. Not now, when I needed this job more than I'd ever needed anything in my entire life. "Mrs. Jenkins, please," I begged, tears starting to blur my vision and my voice cracking with desperation. "I have a sick child who depends on me. I need this job to pay for his cancer treatment. I need the health insurance. Please just check the security cameras more carefully. Interview all the other employees again. Give me a chance to prove my innocence. The cameras show you in the break room at the relevant times," she said, standing up and moving toward the door. "The timeline matches the reported thefts. That's sufficient evidence as far as I'm concerned." She pressed a button on her desk phone and I heard her voice through the intercom. "Security to the housekeeping office, please. We have a terminated employee who needs to be escorted out." The next few minutes passed in a blur of humiliation and disbelief. 2 security guards arrived. Both men I'd greeted cheerfully every single day for over 2 years. Bob was an older black man with kind eyes and a gentle manner who always asked about Marcus's treatment. Steve was younger, a former military guy who was usually all business but had always been respectful and professional with me. Now they looked at me with a mixture of disappointment and suspicion, as if I'd personally betrayed their trust. It was clear that they'd already been briefed on the situation and had accepted Patricia's version of events without question. "Ma'am, we need to escort you to your locker so you can collect your personal belongings, and then we'll walk you off the premises," Bob said gently, his voice carrying a note of sadness that suggested he was uncomfortable with the situation but had no choice but to follow protocol. The walk to the employee locker room felt like a death march through my former life. Word had somehow already spread throughout the hospital. I could see it in the way conversations stopped when I approached, in the sideways glances and whispered comments, in the way some people suddenly found urgent tasks that required them to turn away when they saw me coming. Some of my former coworkers looked sympathetic, as if they couldn't quite believe the accusations but didn't know what to say or do. Others looked judgmental and disappointed, as if they'd always suspected I might be capable of something like this. A few just looked uncomfortable, like they wanted to pretend the whole situation wasn't happening. I opened my locker with shaking hands, trying to maintain some dignity while the security guards watched my every move. Inside were the small personal items that had made this job feel like more than just work. A spare pair of comfortable shoes that I kept for particularly long shifts, my insulated lunchbox that I'd brought from home every day, a small framed picture of Marcus from his 7th birthday party before he got sick. In the photo he was grinning broadly, showing off the gap where he'd lost his front teeth, wearing a superhero cape and flexing his tiny muscles. He'd wanted a superhero-themed party that year because he was convinced that if he could be like his favorite heroes, he could overcome any challenge life threw at him. Looking at that picture now, with everything falling apart around me, I felt my heart breaking into pieces. How was I going to tell him that I'd lost my job? How was I going to explain that we might not be able to afford his treatments? How was I going to look into those trusting eyes and find a way to stay strong for him when I felt like my world was ending? I also grabbed a small plant that I'd kept on the shelf, a pot hose that one of the nurses had given me when I'd mentioned that I was trying to brighten up our small apartment. It had grown and thrived over the months, and somehow taking care of it had become a small source of comfort and hope during the difficult times. The security guards walked me through the main lobby, past the information desk where I'd often chatted with the volunteers during shift changes, past the gift shop where I'd sometimes bought Marcus small toys when he had appointments here for his own blood work and checkups. The automatic doors closed behind me with a soft whoosh that sounded like finality, like the end of a chapter in my life that I hadn't been ready to finish. I stood there in the drizzling rain, clutching my cardboard box of belongings, and felt more alone and desperate than I ever had in my entire life. Not only had I lost my job, but I'd lost my health insurance too. Marcus's next round of chemotherapy was scheduled for the following week, and without insurance the cost would be astronomical, easily more than I made in 3 months at the hospital. My phone buzzed with a text message from Mrs. Elena Rodriguez, the kind elderly woman who lived in our apartment building and watched Marcus when I worked late shifts or double shifts. She only charged me $20 a day, which was far less than any professional childcare service, and she treated Marcus like her own grandson. Diamond mi amor. The text read in the careful English she'd been practicing since moving to Atlanta from El Salvador 30 years earlier. Marcus is asking when you're coming home. He's not feeling well today. The fever came back this afternoon. That text message broke something fundamental inside me. My precious little boy was sick and scared and probably wondering why his mama wasn't there to take care of him, and I'd just lost the one thing that could help ensure his survival. I pulled out my phone and opened the Uber app with trembling fingers, my vision blurred by tears I was trying not to let fall in public. I couldn't afford the ride. Every dollar was precious now. But I also couldn't afford not to get home to Marcus as quickly as possible. I needed to hold him, to reassure him that everything was going to be okay, even though I had no idea how I was going to make that true. The app showed that a car would arrive in 8 minutes. I stood under the small overhang by the hospital's main entrance, trying to stay out of the rain and struggling to keep my emotions under control. Other people walked past me. Families visiting patients, medical staff heading home after their shifts, delivery workers bringing supplies to the hospital, and I wondered if any of them could tell that my life had just been completely destroyed. When a dark blue sedan pulled up to the curb, I didn't even look at the license plate or check the driver's photo the way I usually did. I was too devastated, too overwhelmed with grief and fear and anger to pay attention to details. I just opened the back door and collapsed into the seat like a person fleeing from a burning building. The car interior smelled faintly of coffee and pine air freshener, and it was warm and quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos and humiliation I'd just experienced. For the first time in hours, I felt like I could breathe again. "Diamond?" the driver asked, glancing at me in the rearview mirror with a concerned expression. "Yes," I mumbled, not really paying attention to his voice or his face. I was staring out the window at the hospital building, thinking about how everything had changed so quickly and so completely. "Can you please take me to Riverside Apartments on Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard?" "Of course," he said softly, his voice carrying a gentleness that somehow made me feel slightly less alone. The car pulled away from the hospital, and that's when the dam broke completely. All the fear, anger, desperation, and overwhelming sadness I'd been holding back came pouring out in ugly, gasping sobs that shook my entire body. I tried to cry quietly at first, not wanting to make the driver uncomfortable, but the emotions were too powerful to contain. "I'm so sorry," I choked out between tears, feeling embarrassed about breaking down in front of a complete stranger. "I'm having the worst day of my entire life and I can't seem to stop crying." "It's okay," the driver said gently, his voice filled with genuine compassion. "Sometimes we all need to cry. Sometimes the world gives us more than we can handle, and crying is the only way to let some of the pressure out." Something about his kind, understanding tone opened the floodgates completely. Maybe it was because he was a stranger who didn't know me or have any reason to judge me. Maybe it was because I'd been holding everything inside for so long, trying to be strong for Marcus and keeping my fears and worries to myself so I wouldn't burden anyone else. But suddenly I found myself telling him everything. "I just got fired from my job at the children's hospital," I said, wiping my nose with tissues from the small pack I always carried in my purse. "They accused me of stealing money from other employees' purses and lockers. But I didn't do it. I swear on everything I hold sacred, I didn't do it." The driver glanced at me in the rearview mirror, and I could see kindness and concern in his eyes, but he didn't say anything. He just listened, giving me the space to pour out my heart. "My son Marcus is only 8 years old and he has leukemia," I continued, the words tumbling out like water through a broken dam. "Acute lymphoblastic leukemia, which is supposedly one of the more treatable kinds of childhood cancer, but the treatment is still brutal and expensive and terrifying." I told him about the diagnosis, about sitting in the pediatric oncologist's office 6 months earlier while she explained the treatment protocol with charts and diagrams and statistics about survival rates. I told him about the terror in Marcus's eyes when the doctor explained what chemotherapy would be like, how his hair would fall out and he'd be sick and weak for months. I told him about the sleepless nights I'd spent watching Marcus throw up from the treatments, holding his head while he retched into a basin and trying to comfort him when he asked me why this was happening to him. I told him about the day his hair started falling out in clumps, and how I'd sat with him while we shaved off what was left so he wouldn't have to watch it disappear gradually. "He's been so brave through all of this," I said, looking out the window at the Atlanta skyline blurred by rain and tears. "Braver than I am, honestly. He never complains even when he's obviously in pain. He still tries to make jokes and play with his toys and act like a normal kid." I told the driver about the port they'd surgically implanted in Marcus's chest to make the chemotherapy treatments easier, and how Marcus had named it Mr. Button, to make it seem less scary. I told him about the way he'd decorated his hospital room with superhero posters and action figures, creating elaborate storylines where the heroes were fighting cancer cells instead of traditional villains. "The treatment costs are astronomical even with insurance," I continued, feeling like I needed to explain everything, to make this stranger understand why the job loss was so devastating. "The co-pays for each chemo session, the specialized medications, the regular blood tests and scans, it adds up to thousands of dollars every month." I told him how I'd been working every extra shift available, how I'd sold everything valuable I owned, how I'd applied for every assistance program and charity fund I could find. I told him about the notebooks full of calculations on my kitchen table, the different scenarios I'd worked out for stretching our money, the payment plans I'd negotiated with various medical providers. "I know I probably look suspicious because I've been stressed about money," I said, staring at my reflection in the car window. "I've been making phone calls during my breaks about payment plans and financial assistance programs. I've been asking coworkers if they knew about any resources that might help. But I would never steal from them. Never. The driver pulled up to a red light and turned to look at me directly for the first time. He was a black man who appeared to be in his early 40s, with kind eyes, a gentle face and salt and pepper hair that was neatly trimmed. He wore a simple button-down shirt and looked tired, like someone who'd been working long hours but was still willing to listen to a stranger's problems. "What kind of treatment does your son need?" he asked quietly, his voice filled with genuine concern rather than idle curiosity. "He's in the middle of a 2-year chemotherapy protocol," I explained, grateful that he was asking and seemed to actually care about the answer. "We're about 8 months in, which means we're past the hardest part, but there's still over a year of treatment left. The insurance covers the basic chemotherapy, but his oncologist wants to add an experimental drug that could significantly improve his long-term prognosis." "How much would that cost?" The question surprised me. Most people, when they heard numbers related to medical treatment, either changed the subject or made sympathetic noises without really wanting to know the details. "The experimental treatment alone would cost $30,000, I said, hearing the impossibility of that number even as I spoke it. "That's on top of all the regular treatment costs. Then there are the additional monitoring tests, potential side effects that might require hospitalization, travel costs for seeing specialists who aren't local." I laughed bitterly, wiping away fresh tears. "We're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars over the course of his treatment. Money I could never earn or save or borrow, no matter how hard I worked or how much I sacrificed." The light turned green, and the driver continued in thoughtful silence for several blocks. I assumed he was just being polite, the way strangers sometimes ask questions they don't really want detailed answers to, so I went back to staring out the window and trying to figure out what I was going to do next. "You said you didn't steal the money," he said eventually, breaking the silence. "I didn't. I swear on Marcus's life I didn't take a single dollar from anyone," I replied with absolute conviction. "I've never stolen anything in my entire life, not even when I was desperate or hungry or scared." "But they fired you anyway." "They said the security footage showed me in the break room at the times when money went missing," I explained, feeling the injustice of it all over again. "But I clean that break room every single day as part of my regular route. Of course I was there. It's my job to be there." "Did they actually show you the footage?" I paused, thinking back to my conversation with Mrs. Jenkins. In all the shock and emotion of the moment, I hadn't really analyzed the specifics of what she'd said and what she'd shown me. "No," I realized. "They just said the footage was proof of my guilt. They wouldn't let me see it or explain exactly what it showed. Mrs. Jenkins just said the timeline matched up with the reported thefts." The driver nodded slowly, as if this information was somehow significant. "What was the name of your supervisor?" "Patricia Jenkins. She runs the housekeeping department and has been there for over 20 years. "And the hospital was St. Mary's Children's Hospital?" "Yes, on Peachtree Street. Why are you asking all these questions?" Instead of answering, he pulled out his phone and made a call. I could only hear his side of the conversation, but his tone was completely different now, authoritative, businesslike, and carrying an undertone of controlled anger that I hadn't heard before. "Yes, this is Michael Harrison," he said into the phone. "I need to speak with the chief administrator at St. Mary's Children's Hospital immediately, and I don't care if it's after hours. Wake him up if you have to." My heart started pounding. This wasn't normal Uber driver behavior, and I was suddenly very aware that I was alone in a car with a man I didn't know, who was making phone calls to hospital administrators and using a tone of voice that suggested he had significant authority. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He held up a finger to indicate I should wait, still talking on the phone. "David, it's Michael Harrison. I need you to pull the security footage from your employee break room for the past 2 weeks, and I need it done tonight. Yes, I know it's unusual, but this is important. I also need you to review the termination of a custodial employee named Diamond Williams today." "What do you mean you don't know about any termination?" He was quiet for a long moment, listening to whoever was on the other end of the call, and I could see his expression growing darker and more serious with each passing second. "I see," he said finally, his voice tight with controlled fury. "David, I need you to meet me at the hospital in exactly 1 hour. Bring the head of human resources, the head of security, and whoever this Patricia Jenkins is, because someone has been stealing from your employees, and they just fired an innocent woman to cover their tracks." He hung up and looked at me in the rearview mirror with an expression I couldn't quite read. "I'm not your Uber driver," he said simply. "What do you mean?" "My name is Michael Harrison. I'm on the board of directors at St. Mary's Children's Hospital, and I'm also the CEO of Harrison Medical Group, which owns several hospitals and medical facilities throughout Georgia and the Southeast." I stared at him in complete shock, trying to process this information. "You're what?" "I was leaving a late board meeting when I saw you crying outside the hospital building," he explained. "You looked like you needed help, so I offered you a ride. When you started telling me what had happened, I realized there was something very wrong with the situation." The car suddenly felt very small, and I was overwhelmed with embarrassment and mortification. I'd just spent the last 25 minutes pouring my heart out to one of the most powerful and influential men in Atlanta's medical community, complaining about his own hospital and revealing every intimate detail of my family's financial struggles. "Oh God," I whispered, covering my face with my hands. "I'm so sorry. I had no idea who you were. I thought you were just a taxi driver. I've been going on and on about my problems, and you're probably thinking I'm some crazy woman who—" "Don't apologize," he interrupted, his voice firm but kind. "I'm glad you told me what happened. It sounds like there's been a serious injustice here, and if what you're telling me is true, then someone needs to be held accountable." He pulled into the parking lot of my apartment complex and turned around to face me completely. The apartment building was a modest 3-story brick structure with small balconies and a playground area where kids could play. It wasn't luxurious, but it was clean and safe, and Marcus and I had made it into a home. "Diamond, I want you to listen to me very carefully," Michael said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from years of making important decisions. "Based on what you've told me and based on what I just learned from our chief administrator, something is very wrong at St. Mary's. David Morrison, he's the head administrator, had no knowledge of your termination today. That means Patricia Jenkins fired you without going through proper channels or following established protocols. But she said she had talked to HR and administration." I protested weakly. "She lied," Michael said bluntly. "And if she lied about that, then we need to examine everything else she told you. The security footage, the timeline of the thefts, the evidence she claimed to have, all of it needs to be reviewed by people who weren't involved in the original investigation." He pulled out his phone and showed me a contact screen with his personal information. "This is my direct number," he said. "I want you to be at St. Mary's tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. sharp. Meet me in the main lobby near the information desk. We're going to get to the bottom of this situation and find out what really happened." "Mr. Harrison, I can't ask you to get involved in my problems," I said, still struggling to believe this was really happening. "You have important responsibilities, and I'm just a custodial worker who—" "You're not asking," he interrupted. "I'm offering. And Diamond, if you're telling the truth about not stealing that money, and I believe you are, then someone else did steal it and they've destroyed an innocent person's life to cover their tracks. That's completely unacceptable to me, both as a board member of the hospital and as a human being." I sat there for a moment, overwhelmed by this unexpected turn of events. Just hours earlier, I'd thought my life was over, that I'd lost everything and had no way to provide for Marcus's medical care. Now, one of the most powerful men in the Atlanta medical community was offering to help me prove my innocence and potentially get my job back. "Why are you doing this?" I asked quietly. "You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. Why would you go out of your way to help a stranger?" Michael was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the apartment complex where children's bicycles lay scattered across the small yards and laundry hung from balcony railings to dry. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer and more personal than it had been before. "I have a daughter named Sophia," he said eventually. "She's 12 years old now, but when she was Marcus's age, 8 years old, she was diagnosed with a rare blood disorder called aplastic anemia. For 6 months, I didn't know if she was going to live or die." He paused, and I could see the memory of that fear and uncertainty playing across his face. "During that time, while she was in and out of the hospital, I met a lot of parents like you. Single mothers working 2 or 3 jobs, trying to pay for treatments while their children suffered. Fathers who had lost their health insurance and were trying to figure out how to afford life-saving medications. Families who had to choose between paying rent and paying for chemotherapy." His voice grew even softer. "I saw how the medical system, despite all its amazing capabilities and dedicated professionals, can absolutely crush people who are already dealing with the unimaginable stress of watching their child fight for their life. What happened to your daughter? She survived, he said with a smile that transformed his entire face. She's healthy now, playing soccer 3 times a week and arguing with me about her bedtime and whether she's old enough to have her own cell phone. But I never forgot those other parents I met during her treatment. The ones who didn't have my resources, my connections, my ability to make phone calls that actually get answered and returned. He turned back to me. So when I can help someone in a situation like that, when I have the power and influence to make a difference, I feel obligated to do it. It's not charity and it's not pity. It's just recognizing that we all need help sometimes, and those of us who have the ability to help should do it. And you really think you can help me? I think we can find out the truth about what happened, he said carefully. I can't promise that everything will work out perfectly, but I can promise that we'll conduct a proper investigation and make sure you're treated fairly. If you're innocent, and I believe you are, then we'll prove it. I started crying again, but this time it was from relief and gratitude rather than despair and hopelessness. Thank you, I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. Thank you so much. You have no idea what this means to me, what it means to Marcus. Don't thank me yet, he said with a slight smile. Thank me after we fix this mess and find out who's really been stealing from your coworkers. I got out of the car and walked toward my apartment building on unsteady legs, still trying to process everything that had happened. At the entrance, I turned back to see Michael still sitting in his car, talking on his phone again. Even from a distance, I could tell from his body language that he was angry and that he was making things happen. Upstairs in our small 2-bedroom apartment, I found Marcus curled up on our old couch with Mrs. Rodriguez, watching cartoons on the second-hand television I'd bought at a yard sale the previous year. He looked so small and fragile in his superhero pajamas, his bald head covered by his favorite beanie that had a picture of Superman on the front. Despite his illness and all the treatments he'd endured, Marcus still had the most beautiful, expressive eyes I'd ever seen. They were exactly like his father's eyes, but filled with a wisdom and resilience that Jerome had never possessed. "Mama," he said when he saw me, trying to sound excited and energetic despite the obvious fatigue in his voice. Mrs. Rodriguez made me chicken soup with little stars in it, and we watched 3 episodes of Spider-Man cartoons. I sat down next to him on the couch and pulled him into my arms, breathing in the scent of the gentle, fragrance-free shampoo we had to use on his sensitive scalp. He felt warm against me and I could tell his fever had broken, which was a relief. "How are you feeling, baby boy?" I asked, smoothing his beanie and checking his forehead with my hand. "Better than this morning," he admitted honestly. "My tummy was upset earlier, but Mrs. Rodriguez gave me ginger ale and crackers and now I'm just tired. The doctor said being tired after chemo is normal, right?" "That's right, sweetheart. Your body is working very hard to get better, so it needs extra rest." Mrs. Rodriguez gathered her knitting and her purse, preparing to leave for the evening. She was a wonderful woman in her 70s who had immigrated to Atlanta from El Salvador 30 years earlier. Her English was accented but clear, and she had a grandmother's intuition about when children needed extra attention and care. "He ate some soup and kept it down," she reported quietly, speaking in the mixture of English and Spanish we'd developed over the months she'd been helping us. "No fever since about 2 o'clock this afternoon. He asked about you several times, but I told him you had to work late at the hospital." After she left, I held Marcus while he dozed against my shoulder, staring at the pile of medical bills and insurance statements on my kitchen table and trying to process everything that had happened. The same bills that had been overwhelming me that morning now seemed like they might be manageable if Michael Harrison could actually help me get my job back. Was it possible that this nightmare day could actually have a positive ending? Or was I setting myself up for more disappointment and heartbreak? That night I barely slept at all. I kept replaying my conversation with Mrs. Jenkins, trying to remember every detail of what she'd said and how she'd said it. I thought about the security footage she claimed to have seen, the timeline of the thefts she'd described, and the way she'd been so quick and definitive about terminating me without giving me a chance to defend myself or present my side of the story. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that there had been something almost rehearsed about her accusations, as if she'd prepared what she was going to say in advance. And the fact that she hadn't shown me the actual footage, just referred to it in general terms, seemed suspicious in retrospect. The next morning I woke up early and spent extra time getting ready. I chose my best outfit, a navy blue dress that I'd worn to Marcus's school events and medical appointments when I wanted to look professional and put together. I did my hair and makeup carefully, wanting to look respectable and credible when I faced whatever was waiting for me at the hospital. Marcus was still sleeping when I checked on him at 7:30. His fever was completely gone and his breathing was steady and peaceful. Mrs. Rodriguez had agreed to come early so I could get to the hospital on time, and I'd prepared everything he might need during the day. "Mama, why are you dressed up?" he asked when he woke up and saw me putting on my good shoes. He looked at me with those wise, serious eyes that children with serious illnesses develop too early. "I have a very important meeting this morning," I told him honestly. "Remember how I told you yesterday that I lost my job at the hospital?" He nodded solemnly, his expression showing that he understood this was serious even if he didn't fully grasp all the implications. "Well, I think I might have a chance to get it back. A very nice man is going to help me prove that I didn't do anything wrong." "Like a superhero?" Marcus asked, his face lighting up with interest. Despite everything he'd been through, he still believed in heroes and happy endings. "Maybe," I smiled, leaning down to kiss his forehead. "Kind of like a superhero, but one who wears a suit instead of a cape." At 8:45, I stood outside St. Mary's Children's Hospital, looking up at the same building where I'd worked for over 2 years and from which I'd been escorted in shame just 24 hours earlier. The morning air was crisp and clear, and I could see families walking through the main entrance. Parents carrying scared children, grandparents with worried faces, siblings trying to be brave for their sick brothers and sisters. All of these people were dealing with their own medical crises, their own fears about the future, their own struggles to navigate the complex world of pediatric healthcare. Looking at them reminded me why I'd loved my job so much, despite its modest pay and demanding physical requirements. I'd been part of something important, contributing to the healing environment that these families desperately needed. At exactly 9 a.m., a black luxury sedan pulled up to the curb with the smooth, quiet purr of an expensive engine. Michael Harrison stepped out, dressed in an impeccably tailored charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than I made in 3 months. But despite his obviously expensive clothes and the unmistakable air of wealth and authority he carried, his expression was warm and reassuring when he saw me. "Good morning, Diamond," he said, walking up to me with a confident stride. "Are you ready to find out what really happened yesterday?" "I'm nervous," I admitted honestly. "What if they have evidence that makes me look guilty even though I'm not? What if Patricia Jenkins really did see something on those security cameras? Then we'll deal with whatever we find," he said firmly. "But remember, you have nothing to hide. You're the victim here, not the perpetrator. We're going to get to the truth, whatever it is." We walked through the main lobby together, past the information desk where I'd once chatted with volunteers during shift changes, past the gift shop where I'd sometimes bought Marcus small toys and books when he had appointments here for his own blood work and checkups. Being back in this familiar environment felt surreal, like returning to a place from a dream or a past life. Michael led me to an elevator I'd never used before, one that required a special key card to access the executive floors. The elevator was newer and more luxurious than the ones the regular staff used, with polished brass fixtures and soft lighting that made everyone look more distinguished. We rode up in comfortable silence, and I tried to calm my racing heart and prepare myself for whatever was waiting. The executive floors were as intimidating as I'd imagined, with thick carpets, expensive artwork, and the kind of hushed, serious atmosphere that suggested important decisions were made here regularly. The conference room Michael led me to was unlike anything I'd ever seen in person. It had a massive polished mahogany table that could easily seat 20 people, surrounded by leather chairs that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Atlanta skyline, and the morning sun streamed through them, casting everything in a golden light that made the room seem almost magical. Seated around the table were several people I recognized and some I didn't, all looking serious and professional in their expensive business attire. The tension in the room was palpable, and I could tell that this was much more than a routine meeting. David Morrison, the chief administrator, was a tall, distinguished white man in his 50s who always seemed to be rushing somewhere important when I'd seen him in the hospital hallways. I'd never spoken to him directly, but I'd always gotten the impression that he was competent and fair in his management style. Patricia Jenkins sat at the far end of the table, looking smaller and more nervous than I'd ever seen her in the 2 years I'd worked under her supervision. Her usual stern confidence was completely gone, replaced by something that looked almost like fear. She kept fidgeting with her hands and avoiding eye contact with everyone in the room. Also present were 2 people from Human Resources who I'd seen around the hospital but had never interacted with, a woman I didn't recognize who appeared to be a lawyer based on her briefcase and legal pad, and 2 security guards who looked uncomfortable about being in such a formal setting. The atmosphere in the room was charged with tension and anticipation, like the moment before a thunderstorm when you can feel the electricity in the air. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Michael said, taking his place at the head of the table and gesturing for me to sit in the chair beside him. "As I explained in my calls last night, we have a serious situation that needs to be resolved immediately and thoroughly." David Morrison cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable. "Mr. Harrison, I have to say this is highly unusual. We typically handle employee termination issues through established HR procedures, and Patricia has explained the situation with Ms. Williams. While we always regret having to terminate employees, theft is a serious offense that requires immediate action. Has anyone in this room actually reviewed the security footage that supposedly shows Ms. Williams stealing money?" Michael asked, his voice carrying a sharp edge that suggested he already knew the answer. There was a moment of uncomfortable silence as people looked around the table at each other. "Patricia assured us that the footage clearly showed," David began, but Michael cut him off. "I asked if anyone has actually reviewed the footage," Michael repeated, his voice taking on an even harder edge. "Not whether someone told you about it or assured you of something. I want to know if you, personally, have seen the video evidence that was used to terminate Ms. Williams." David looked around the table again, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the questioning. "Well, no, I haven't personally reviewed the footage, but our security procedures." "Patricia." Michael turned to my former supervisor with the kind of intense focus that made it impossible for her to look away. "You said you reviewed the security footage before making the decision to terminate Ms. Williams. Where is that footage now?" Patricia's face had gone pale, and I could see sweat beginning to form on her forehead despite the comfortable temperature in the room. The footage is being processed by our security department. I provided them with my report based on my preliminary review of the evidence." "I see," Michael said, his tone suggesting that he saw much more than Patricia was comfortable with. "Well, it's fortunate that I had our IT department pull all the security footage from the employee areas for the past 3 weeks last night." He opened his briefcase and pulled out a laptop computer, placing it on the polished conference table and opening it so everyone could see the screen. The laptop was clearly expensive and high-end, and the way Michael handled it suggested he was completely comfortable with technology despite his executive position. "Let's start with October 15th, he said, navigating through files with practiced efficiency. "That was the date of the first reported theft, when nurse Rebecca Martinez discovered that $40 was missing from her purse, which she had left in her locker during her shift from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. The security footage began playing on the laptop screen, showing the employee break room from a camera mounted high in one corner. The image was clear and detailed, showing the tables where employees ate their meals, the row of lockers where they stored their personal belongings, and the various entrances and exits to the room. I watched myself enter the break room at exactly 8:03 a.m., pushing my cleaning cart and carrying my supplies with the efficient, practiced movements of someone who had performed the same tasks hundreds of times. On the screen, I methodically wiped down the tables and counters, emptied the trash cans and mopped the floor just as I did every single day. "As you can see," Michael narrated in a calm, professional voice, "Diamond entered the break room at 8:03 a.m. and left at 8:14 a.m. During this time she performed her regular cleaning duties, wiping down surfaces, emptying trash receptacles and cleaning the floor. At no point did she approach the lockers or interact with any personal belongings." He fast-forwarded through several hours of footage, showing various employees coming and going, eating their lunches, and using the break room for its intended purposes. Everything looked completely normal and routine. The next person to enter the break room after the regular flow of employees was... He paused as a figure appeared on the screen. "Patricia Jenkins at 10:47 a.m. We all watched in stunned silence as Patricia entered the break room, looked around carefully to make sure she was alone, and then walked directly to the row of lockers. She tried several handles systematically before finding one that was unlocked, opened it and reached inside. From her body language and the way she moved, it was obvious that she was taking something out of the locker. The silence in the room was so complete that I could hear the air conditioning system humming and the distant sounds of traffic from the street below. Patricia remained in the break room for approximately 4 minutes. Michael continued, his voice remaining emotionally neutral despite the shocking nature of what we were all witnessing. During this time, she opened 3 different lockers and removed what appears to be cash from at least 2 of them. Patricia had gone completely white and was gripping the edge of the conference table so tightly that her knuckles were pale. Her breathing had become rapid and shallow, and she looked like she might faint or vomit at any moment. Let's continue to October 22nd, Michael said, closing that file and opening another one. This was the date when Dr. Thompson reported that $60 was missing from his wallet. The footage from that day showed exactly the same pattern. I performed my regular cleaning duties in the morning, and then hours later, Patricia entered the break room, looked around nervously to make sure she was alone, and went straight to the lockers. This time she was more confident and efficient in her movements, suggesting that she had refined her technique with practice. October 28th, Michael continued, showing another day's footage. And November 2nd. And November 5th. Each piece of footage showed the same devastating pattern. I would clean the break room as part of my regular duties, interacting only with cleaning supplies and furniture. Later, Patricia would enter the room, check to make sure she was unobserved, and systematically go through lockers until she found ones that were unlocked and contained cash or other valuables. In total, Michael said, closing the laptop with a decisive snap, the security footage shows Patricia Jenkins entering the employee break room and accessing employee lockers without permission on 8 different occasions over the past 3 weeks. During this same period, Diamond Williams performed her regular cleaning duties and had absolutely no inappropriate interaction with any personal belongings or lockers. The silence in the room was deafening. I could feel everyone's eyes moving between Patricia and me, trying to process what we had all just witnessed. The evidence was so clear, so unambiguous, that there was no room for interpretation or doubt. I stared at Patricia, feeling a mixture of vindication, anger, and something that might have been pity. This woman had held my son's future in her hands and had chosen to destroy it to protect herself from the consequences of her own criminal actions. Patricia, David Morrison's voice was cold with barely controlled fury. Is what we just saw an accurate representation of your actions over the past 3 weeks? Patricia looked like a cornered animal, trapped and desperate. Her hands were shaking visibly, and sweat had begun to bead on her forehead despite the cool temperature in the conference room. I can explain, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It's not what it looks like. I was going to replace everything. I just needed to borrow the money temporarily. You stole from your co-workers, David said, his voice getting louder and more incredulous with each word. People who trusted you, people who work alongside you every day trying to help sick children. And then you blamed an innocent employee to cover your tracks. My husband lost his job 8 months ago, Patricia said desperately, as if her personal circumstances could somehow justify her actions. His unemployment benefits ran out and our mortgage payment doubled when our adjustable rate reset. My daughter's wedding is next month and we'd already put deposits down on everything. The venue, the catering, the flowers, her dress. She looked around the room pleadingly, as if hoping someone would understand her desperation. We were going to lose our house. 30 years of mortgage payments and we were going to lose everything. I was desperate. I thought if I could just borrow a little money here and there until Tom found another job, I could pay everyone back and no one would ever know. So you destroyed this woman's life instead, Michael said, his voice filled with controlled rage that was somehow more intimidating than if he had been shouting. You cost her a job she desperately needed to pay for her son's cancer treatment. You had her banned from the premises. You ruined her reputation and potentially jeopardized her child's access to life-saving medical care. Patricia finally looked directly at me for the first time since I'd entered the room. Her eyes were filled with tears, guilt, and what appeared to be genuine remorse, but it was far too little and far too late. Diamond, I'm so sorry, she said, her voice breaking. I never meant for it to go this far. I never intended to hurt you or Marcus. When the thefts were reported, I panicked. I thought if I could blame someone else just temporarily, I could figure out how to replace the money and make everything right. How could you? I asked quietly, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside me. You knew about Marcus and his leukemia. You knew I was struggling to pay for his treatments. You knew that losing this job could literally mean the difference between life and death for my child. How could you look at yourself in the mirror after doing something like that? Patricia broke down completely, sobbing into her hands with the kind of raw, ugly crying that comes from deep shame and the complete collapse of a carefully constructed life. David Morrison stood up, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. Patricia Jenkins, your employment with St. Mary's Children's Hospital is terminated immediately, effective right now. Security will escort you from the building, and you are permanently banned from all hospital property. We will be conducting a full investigation into the extent of your thefts, and we will absolutely be pressing criminal charges. He turned to the lawyer who had been taking notes throughout the entire proceeding. I want a complete audit of all reported thefts over the past year, cross-referenced with Patricia's access to employee areas. I want to know exactly how much money was stolen and from how many employees. Then he turned to me, his expression softening with what appeared to be genuine remorse. Ms. Williams, on behalf of St. Mary's Children's Hospital, I offer you our most sincere and heartfelt apologies. What happened to you yesterday is completely unacceptable and goes against everything this institution stands for. We failed you in the most fundamental way possible, and there's no excuse for that. Diamond's job will be restored immediately, Michael added, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of authority that suggested this was not open for negotiation. With full back pay for the time she was wrongfully terminated, a formal letter of apology that completely clears her name and reputation, and a commendation in her personnel file recognizing her exemplary service to this hospital. Absolutely, David agreed quickly, clearly understanding that his own position might be in jeopardy if he didn't handle this situation perfectly. We'll also be conducting a complete review of our security protocols and employee supervision procedures to ensure that nothing like this ever happens again. As the meeting began to break up and Patricia was led away by security guards who looked almost as uncomfortable as she did, Michael turned to me with an expression I couldn't quite read. There's one more thing we need to discuss, he said, his voice taking on a more personal tone. I've been thinking about Marcus's situation, and I have some ideas that might help. He pulled out his phone and showed me a contact screen with a woman's name and professional credentials. This is Dr. Sarah Chin. She's one of the top pediatric oncologists in the country, and she works at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta. She specializes in exactly the type of leukemia Marcus has, and she's been conducting clinical trials with some very promising new treatments. Mr. Harrison, I don't understand what you're suggesting, I said, afraid to hope for too much after everything that had already happened. I called her last night after our conversation and explained Marcus's case, he continued. She's agreed to review his medical records and meet with both of you this afternoon. If Marcus qualifies for one of her clinical trials, all of his treatment, including the experimental drugs his current oncologist mentioned, would be completely free. I felt like the room was spinning around me. Are you serious? Is this really possible? Dr. Chen's research is funded by pharmaceutical companies that are developing new cancer treatments. They cover all costs associated with the trials, including medications, hospital stays, follow-up care, and even transportation assistance for families who need to travel for appointments. I broke down crying right there in the executive conference room, overwhelmed by the complete reversal of fortune. 24 hours earlier, I'd thought my son was going to die because I couldn't afford his treatment. I'd lost my job, my insurance, and what felt like all hope for the future. Now, not only did I have my job back with a clean reputation, but Marcus might have access to cutting-edge treatment that could not just save his life, but give him the best possible chance for a complete cure. Why? I asked through my tears, looking at Michael with gratitude so profound that I didn't have words to express it. Why are you doing all of this for us? You barely know us. You don't owe us anything. Michael sat down in the chair next to mine, his formal executive demeanor softening into something more human and personal. Because everyone deserves a chance, Diamond, he said simply. Because children shouldn't die from treatable diseases just because their parents can't afford the treatment. Because parents shouldn't have to choose between working and saving their children's lives. And because sometimes when the universe puts people in your path, you have an opportunity to make a real difference in their lives. He paused, looking out the window at the city skyline where the morning sun was burning off the last of the overnight clouds. Yesterday you got into my car by mistake thinking I was your Uber driver. But maybe it wasn't really a mistake. Maybe it was exactly what was supposed to happen, exactly when it was supposed to happen. 3 hours later, I found myself sitting in Dr. Sarah Chen's office at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta, watching her review Marcus's medical records with the kind of focused attention and expertise that gave me more hope than I'd felt in months. Dr. Chen was a petite Asian woman in her 40s with kind eyes and the sort of calm, competent presence that immediately made me trust her judgment. Her office was filled with awards, medical journals, and photographs of children who had been her patients. Some clearly taken during treatment, others showing healthy, happy kids who had beaten their cancer. Marcus is actually an excellent candidate for our current clinical trial, she said, looking up at me with a genuine smile. His blood work shows that he's responding well to the standard chemotherapy protocol, but the experimental drug we're testing could significantly improve his long-term prognosis and reduce the risk of relapse. And this treatment is really completely free? I asked, still hardly able to believe it. Completely free, she confirmed. The pharmaceutical company funding the trial covers all costs associated with the treatment, including the experimental medication, all monitoring tests, any additional hospitalizations that might be needed, and comprehensive follow-up care for 5 years after the completion of treatment. She showed me a thick folder containing information about the trial, consent forms, and detailed explanations of the potential benefits and risks. The experimental drug is called L-asparaginase Plus, and it's a modified version of a medication that's already proven effective in treating childhood leukemia. Our early results suggest that it may be significantly more effective than the standard treatment, with fewer long-term side effects. I felt like I was living in a dream that was too good to be true. That morning, I'd woken up unemployed, uninsured, and facing the possibility that my son might die because I couldn't afford his treatment. Now, not only did I have my job back, but Marcus had access to potentially life-saving treatment that was beyond anything I could have hoped for. But the most important part of this story was still to come. Over the next several months, Marcus responded to the experimental treatment better than anyone had dared to hope. His cancer markers dropped to levels that his original oncologist described as remarkable, and by his 6-month follow-up appointment he was officially in complete remission. The new medication had not only stopped the progression of his cancer but had eliminated it entirely with minimal side effects. Dr. Chen told me that Marcus's response was one of the most dramatic and successful outcomes they'd seen in the entire clinical trial. As for Patricia Jenkins, she was arrested and charged with multiple counts of theft. During the investigation that followed, it came out that she'd been stealing from employees for over 18 months, not just the few weeks I'd been accused of. The total amount was over $3,000, taken from more than a dozen different employees. Several other workers came forward to report money that had gone missing from their lockers, but they'd been too afraid to report it officially, thinking they'd be blamed for being careless with their belongings or that no one would believe them without proof. Patricia ultimately pleaded guilty to avoid a trial and served 8 months in jail. During her incarceration, she participated in counseling programs designed to help people understand and address the underlying issues that lead to criminal behavior. When she was released, she moved to another state to start over with her family. The hospital implemented new security protocols, including additional cameras in all employee areas and a completely revamped system for reporting and investigating workplace theft. They also created an anonymous tip line for employees to report concerns about workplace safety, theft, or other issues. But the most amazing and life-changing part of this story happened about 14 months after that terrible October day when I thought my world was ending. Michael Harrison had kept in touch with our family throughout Marcus's treatment, checking in regularly to make sure we had everything we needed and that the clinical trial was going smoothly. When Marcus was declared officially cured and graduated from the experimental treatment program, Michael invited us to a celebration dinner at one of Atlanta's finest restaurants. "I have something important I want to discuss with you," he said as we sat down at our table in the elegant dining room. Marcus, whose hair had grown back thick and curly, was fascinated by the fancy silverware and kept asking questions about everything on the menu. "Diamond," Michael continued, his tone becoming more serious and businesslike, "I've been incredibly impressed by your strength, your integrity, and your dedication throughout this entire ordeal. You handled an impossible situation with grace and dignity, and you never lost sight of what was most important: Marcus's well-being and recovery. Thank you, I said, not sure where this conversation was heading but feeling grateful for his kind words. I have a proposition for you, he said, leaning forward slightly. Harrison Medical Group is expanding our patient advocacy program. We're creating a new department specifically focused on helping families navigate the healthcare system when they're dealing with serious pediatric illnesses, and we need someone to head up this initiative. He paused, watching Marcus carefully arrange his napkin in his lap the way he'd seen people do in movies. The position would involve working directly with families like yours, people who are overwhelmed by the medical system, who don't know how to access available resources, who are struggling to pay for treatment or understand their insurance coverage. You would be their advocate, helping them find financial assistance programs, connecting them with the right specialists, and making sure they don't fall through the cracks the way you almost did. I stared at him, hardly believing what I was hearing. This sounded like a dream job, the kind of position that would allow me to use my own experience to help other families facing similar crises. It would mean leaving your position at St. Mary's, he continued, but the salary would be significantly higher than what you're making now, and you'd have comprehensive health insurance for both you and Marcus. More importantly, you'd be using your personal experience and hard-won knowledge to help other families avoid the kind of nightmare you went through. I don't have any formal training in patient advocacy, I said, feeling overwhelmed by the possibility and simultaneously worried that I wasn't qualified. You have something far more valuable than formal training, Michael replied with conviction. You have lived experience. You know what it's like to be scared and desperate and to feel like the entire medical system is working against you instead of for you. That kind of empathy and understanding, combined with the right training and institutional support, is exactly what families in crisis need most. I looked at Marcus, who was listening to our conversation with the serious, thoughtful expression he'd developed during his treatment. The experience had aged him in some ways, giving him insights and wisdom that most 10-year-olds don't possess, but it had also made him more compassionate and aware of other people's struggles. What do you think, baby? I asked him. Should Mama take a new job helping other families who have sick children like you did? Marcus nodded solemnly, considering the question with the gravity it deserved. Like being a superhero for families with sick kids? He asked. Exactly like being a superhero for families with sick kids, Michael said with a grin that transformed his entire face from serious businessman to warm, caring person. That conversation took place 2 years ago. Today, I run the Harrison Family Advocacy Program, and in that time, we've helped over 400 families successfully navigate pediatric medical crises. We've connected families with appropriate clinical trials, helped them access financial assistance programs they didn't know existed, and advocated for them with insurance companies and hospital administrators who sometimes need reminding that patients are people, not just policy numbers. Every single day, I think about how different things could have been if I hadn't accidentally gotten into Michael Harrison's car that terrible October evening. If I'd waited patiently for my actual Uber driver, if I hadn't been crying and desperate enough to pour my heart out to a complete stranger, if Michael had been less compassionate or too busy to get involved, my son might not be alive today. Marcus is now 11 years old and has been cancer-free for over 18 months. He plays Little League baseball, excels in school, and still talks enthusiastically about wanting to be a doctor when he grows up so he can help other children the way the doctors and nurses helped him during his treatment. He's grown into a remarkable young man with wisdom beyond his years, a deep sense of empathy for others who are struggling, and an unshakable belief that good things can happen even in the darkest circumstances. He often tells people that his cancer was the worst thing that happened to our family, but also the thing that led to all the best things. As for Patricia Jenkins, I heard through mutual acquaintances that she was eventually released from jail and moved to North Carolina to start over with her family. She found work as a secretary at a small medical clinic and has been attending therapy to address the financial pressures and personal issues that led to her stealing. Part of me will always carry some anger about what she did to our family, but I've learned that holding on to resentment only poisons your own happiness and prevents you from moving forward. The real lesson of this story isn't about justice or revenge or getting back at people who wrong you. It's about the incredible transformative power of human kindness and the way one person's compassion can create ripple effects that change multiple lives in ways that couldn't have been imagined. When Michael Harrison saw a crying woman outside his hospital that evening and made the decision to help instead of driving past like most people would have done, he didn't just save my job or secure my son's medical treatment. He gave me a new purpose, a meaningful career that allows me to help hundreds of other families facing the same terror and desperation I once knew intimately. Every family I'm able to help, every child who gets connected to life-saving treatment, every parent who finds hope when they thought all was lost, they're all part of the ongoing ripple effect that started on that rainy October evening when I got into the wrong car and met exactly the right person at exactly the right moment. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had recognized Michael as a hospital board member instead of assuming he was just an Uber driver. Would I have been too intimidated or embarrassed to tell him the complete truth about my situation? Would I have politely thanked him for the ride and missed the opportunity that changed everything for our family? I think there's something beautiful and meaningful about the fact that I told him my story when I thought he was nobody special. Just a kind stranger who was willing to listen to a desperate mother's pain and fear. It means that his decision to help came from pure human compassion rather than any sense of obligation or concern about public relations. That's the kind of person Michael Harrison revealed himself to be, and that's the kind of person I try to be every day in my work with other families. Sometimes the most powerful and transformative thing you can do is simply listen with genuine compassion to someone else's pain, believe their story even when others don't, and then take action to help when you have the ability to do so. Marcus still calls Michael his real-life superhero, and I suppose that's exactly what he turned out to be for our family. But what I've learned through this experience is that we all have the potential to be someone's superhero in moments when they need it most. We all encounter opportunities every day to listen with genuine empathy, to offer help when we can, to stand up for justice even when it's inconvenient, and to believe in hope even when circumstances seem hopeless. That terrible day when I thought my world was ending, when I'd lost my job, my insurance, and what felt like any chance of saving my son's life, that day actually turned out to be the beginning of the most meaningful and purposeful chapter of my life. And it all happened because sometimes, when you're brave enough to tell your story to the right person, the universe conspires to help you in ways you never could have imagined.